musical chairs, see how we land, you know. Now we get into classes 1 to 7, shift. Well, so far as we're concerned in the morning, we're dealing with Sloka 5 of stanza 7. A very long one, a complicated one on which H.P.B. decides to go off in quite numerous directions in her commentary and uses up quite a few spaces. It's interesting how her commentaries sometimes move off in a variety of directions, and at other times her commentary is very brief, as though, well, that's all I wanted to do with that, thank you very much, and let's move on, sort of thing. This is, I think, one of the very fascinating shlokas, however, in setting the man pattern, in recognizing what's going to have to be dealt with much more fully, of course, in anthropogenesis. So let's read through the shloka together. This is page 238 of volume 1, page 238, volume 1.
283.
283 in the Adyar edition, volume 1. The spark hangs from the flame by the finest thread of fohat. I expect that's one of the very oft-quoted passages from the stanzas, isn't it? It should be very familiar to us. The spark hangs from the flame by the finest thread of fohat. You know, here's where you really have to become accustomed to metaphor. You can't take these things literally. Any spark hanging from a flame by a thread is going to really, you know, it becomes very illogical, doesn't it? What's going to happen to the thread? I mean, if you know, it's really going to burn up, isn't it? So you see, immediately you're confronted with something that is not in the realm of logicality, is it? It's not a rational sort of thing. You're having to deal with metaphor. And yet very, very poetic, and somehow, until I pointed it up, I don't suppose anybody laughed at it before. But once you pause to consider it in its very literal terms, impossible. All right. It, of course, this is the spark. It journeys through the 7 worlds of Maya. It stops in the first and is a metal and a stone. It passes into the second, and behold, a plant. The plant whirls through 7 forms and becomes a sacred animal. From the combined attributes of these, Manu the Thinker is formed. Who forms him? The 7 lives and the 1 life. Who completes him? The 5-fold law. And who perfects the last body? Fish, sin, and soma. Great mysteries in here, great mysteries. I think it's Adam who's already dealt with this Kabbalistic becoming a metal and plant and animal. Am I right? Adam, that was you, wasn't it?
I just mentioned it.
You mentioned it. I mean, you mentioned it, and so we've already, to some extent, come across this concept. Well, before we take it up in earnest, please note that here in this shloka is a theme which is found in virtually all mythologies throughout the world, a central theme in the esoteric philosophy. It happens to be one of my favorite themes, which I've dealt with in other series of presentations, not specifically on the Secret Doctrine, but in developing aspects of the esoteric philosophy. And of course that motif is that of a journey, a pilgrimage. It's so important that in understanding the whole cosmogonic process and the human process, this motif of a journey. We all feel we're on a journey. We all feel in some sense we're on a pilgrimage. We're these terms are very interesting. The principle, of course, is enunciated in the at the very outset of our studies in the Secret Doctrine. It really is fundamental to the principle which HPB states in the proem, that what is fundamental, what is the one life, in its regular manifestations periodical, its one absolute attribute is motion. And motion that is purposeful, therefore, that is self-directed, that is, therefore, as I've used the term before, teleological. It is not just motion in a chaotic sense, but rather that it has within it its own self-limiting, self-defining characteristic, self-purposeful, teleological, self-moving. And I think that this is something that we must never lose sight of, so I bring it up once again, that it is there, that Marion and I were talking at breakfast, and one at times would like to sort of move off of the process and would like to, sit down and rest. Maybe it's not so bad to be a laggard, Maybe, although I've always felt that it's rather nice to sort of be in the average, because the laggards are going to have to be first sometime, you see. And that's not a good position either. You'd sort of like to be in the average and sneak along with the rest, if I could put it that way, sort of, not be anonymous in that, yes, in that sense, you see. It always reminds me of the definition of being average. Adam had it on the board, these classes, 2, 3, and 4, which are average humanity. You know what average really is. Average is the lousiest of the best and the best of the lousiest. So, you see, this is, sort of where it's nice to be.
It anyway.
But I suppose I always thought of that because with the initial, my last name, the initial M, you come right in the middle. And no matter how the teachers in my classrooms in my childhood and growing up in class situations, you see, whether sometimes there would be teachers who'd say, we're going to seat you from the last letter to the first, I was still in the middle. Or if they started with A and went through, you see, I was still in the middle. I was no way I could ever be anywhere but in the middle, which is an interesting sort of situation. And you get used to it because then you're sort of, unobserved, except I guess I always did get observed somehow. But anyway, this characteristic of motion and the primary center of consciousness, as it particularizes, we have called, or is called in the Secret Doctrine, the monad. And HPB defines the monad at the very outset. She defines the monad as the eternal pilgrim. It's interesting. Technically we know it's Atman Buddhi, Atma Buddhi. But she, at the very outset, calls the monad the eternal pilgrim. And that very word pilgrim denotes a journey, a pilgrimage. Pilgrims have been defined as persons in motion, passing through territories not their own, seeking something we might call completion or clarity, a goal towards which only the Spirit's compass points the way. This is the definition, incidentally, by Professor Richard Niebuhr of Harvard University, speaking at a program which was held in New York City last May on the sacred journey. Marvelous title.
Would you mind repeating it?
Yes. Pilgrims are persons in motion, passing through territories not their own. And I think that's a particularly useful definition right now as we look at our journey through these 7 worlds of Maya, through territories not their own, seeking something we might call, he said, completion or clarity, a goal towards which only the Spirit's compass points the way.
A goal and then?
Towards which only the Spirit's compass points the way. It's a beautiful definition, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's by who?
Professor Richard Niebuhr, Niebuhr. He's from Harvard University. I've forgotten now what he teaches, I'm sorry to say, what department he's in at Harvard. I think philosophy.
Did he come from Holland, Niebuhr?
That I'm not sure. It certainly sounds like it, doesn't it? And, you know.
No, a young theosophist who went to the States about in the early 50s.
That I'm not sure. You know, I mean, as you all know, I'm sure you find any names in the United States. I mean, after all, we are a country of immigrants, all of us. Some, you know, I mean, my family's been there for 300 years. We came from England, but, you know, but through the years, you know, that's what the United States is built of. Is I mean, what else are we? Everybody was an immigrant. So you find all names, you know, as you know, and they may be Native Americans, but have names that sound, you know, the background may certainly be anything.
Joy, before you keep going, this part here, and when
Perfected?
perfected, no, perfect, and when it's perfect, the last body, and then say fish.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
And somehow you didn't.
Oh, I'm back here on it journeys. I'm way back at journeys. It's just because this point of the journey, I think, is such an interesting one. Niebuhr added, incidentally, in his talk on the sacred journey, our bodies are vehicles of passage, and to make pilgrimage is to exercise our inborn motility, our movement, our inborn motion. It is in this natural propensity to motion that our future as pilgrims is formed, he said. Interesting, you know, very interesting statement, because it defines what we're talking about here, this initial journey, you see. And, for example, one of the interesting points that Niebuhr makes in his talk involved a kind of distinction between sightseers or tourists and pilgrims. And I found this of interest because, you know, in our studies, we can be, you know, whether we're studying the Secret Doctrine as I am through the stanzas, or as Adam is collating it under the title Psychic Evolution, or however, we can go through theosophy or the Theosophical philosophy as tourists, sort of gawking at these concepts, you know, and sort of taking pictures of them. You know, we go through life with our cameras and take pictures, and we can do that. We sort of stare at these wondrous concepts like as though they were magnificent monuments, you know, that were put there in the past. And isn't it beautiful? It's a beautiful concept, like the Taj Mahal is beautiful, or whatever, you see. And we look at them, at the stupendous vista that opens before us, we're attracted or repulsed by some of its features. We may not like the concept of laggards. We may not like the concept of that we have to have a knowledge of evil. There are many things that we may say, well, I'm not quite sure that I like that. And so we extract the things that we like, and we take up those and sort of leave the others. But once we recognize that we are pilgrims, that we really are on a pilgrimage, that on a journey that's a pilgrimage, then I think we approach these truths with a reverence and with a deepening understanding, appreciation, a realization that we're looking at ourselves, not someone else.
It's our own.
Yes, the process is the process of ourselves unfolding within the great cosmogonic picture. And it changes it, do you see? That's why I'm giving it a little bit of special emphasis, not only because it happens to be a favorite subject, but because I think sometimes we begin to look at this as though it's happening to someone else or somewhere else, or something with which we're, it's intellectually tantalizing, and it's fascinating to play around with the rounds and the chains and so on. It's sort of fascinating, and one puts it in different ways and all of this. And so we're simply tourists on this untrodden ground, this continent of thought, if you like. We're simply tourists. But we're not. We're dealing with matters that are of primary concern to us. This is ourselves we're talking about. It's we who are undertaking this. And so with that as a background and my enthusiasm over that and getting a bit worked up, we'll settle back into Sloka 5, you see. Now, what we've noted, of course, again and again and again and again, all that exists in the emanated universe is inwardly united through and in one source. You've heard that before. You'll hear it again, because that is fundamental. In terms of man or the man plant, that inward unity is effected, brought about, by means of a thread self, the Sutratman. And so we're told now that that thread not simply unites us with the flame, the source, if you like, the spark hangs from the flame, but is unified by a creative energy, the finest thread of Fohat, from which the individualized spark depends. All existent things, all that is existent, hangs from or depends upon that inner Fohatic power, that creative energy. Without that flow of power, existent things would cease to be. So this is sharply bringing to our attention that first sentence, that the thread is not just a kind of, well, there's nothing lifeless, but a kind of lifeless just dependence, but rather that it is indeed a thread that is really energy. And that, I think, is something we need to be reminded of. The thread of Fohat, which is then a kind of particularization of Fohat, if you like, out of the universal field. Now, a subtle change that we might overlook is introduced in this shloka. In the previous one, we had, not in the previous, yes, well, in the previous one, but in the ones preceding this throughout, we have had the use of the plural form sparks. Sparks. Now there's a subtle change here to the singular form, the spark. And it seems to me that when such a change occurs, a pattern is being emphasized. Not the particular variations, but rather an archetypal pattern within which individual differences may arise, but which sets the mode for the entire scheme under consideration. This is then the archetypal pattern. The differentiations by the sparks, do you see, may follow that pattern in general, just as there is a pattern for all snowflakes, but no two snowflakes are alike. And so one can talk about the hexagonal characteristic of a snowflake, but that varies, doesn't it? All leaves have a certain archetype, but no two leaves, even on the same kind of tree, are going to be alike. So it seems to me that this points up the fact that what is being given us here in this shloka is again the archetypal pattern. The spark indicates that the journey of all the sparks is in fact the journey of one spark, the son of the divine mind, or divine mind. And I would emphasize this, that the archetypal pattern is established within which freedom exists for individual variations. An archetype, and I stress the word archetype because an archetype does not mean deterministic. Freedom is permitted within it, variations, but only within the lawfulness of the pattern. And I think this hinges on a very important point. Therefore, because the pattern is of the archetype, the first sentence of this shloka could apply to an entire manifested system dependent from the one flame, or to the human complex. And HPB makes very clear in her commentary that her attention is now directed to the latter application. For, of course, she says on page 238 in her commentary, down about the third paragraph, what is that spark which hangs from the flame? Now she localizes it, if you want to put it this way, and that is, she particularizes it. The spark is not necessarily the monad, but it's the jiva, which is the monad in conjunction with manas, or rather, she says, its aroma, that which remains when each personality, from each personality when worthy, and hangs from Atma Buddhi, the flame, by the thread of life. Now, in earlier stanzas, in dealing with this whole process, we've seen the same pattern in terms of the emanation of an entire universe, haven't we? So again, it is reflected. It fixes clearly in our minds the fundamental principle of what HPB has earlier called the radical unity of all existent things. The radical unity, that is to say, the unity at the root, radical in its original sense, not political in any sense, but the radical unity. That is the unity at its roots. I think the word radical has been taken over so by politics that we forget what it really means in its original sense, don't we? We have radical right and radical left and so on, which have long since left any roots of philosophic and basic philosophic positions, it seems to me. Yes?
No, I only always associate it with a radish.
Oh, you do, the radish. Yes, well, all right. Yes, I suppose.
Because a radish is a root.
A radish is a root. Yes, of course. It's the same word, yes. Of course, and a radish is a root. Yes, it's very true. Yes, yes. So you can have your radishes and, eat them too. Well, HPB's commentary on the first sentence of this shloka adds a further very interesting and important point. As she says, and we have just quoted, the spark is the monad in conjunction with manas, or rather its aroma. Barborka points out, and this is in the Divine Plan, page 23, if you like, that it is manas, the mind principle, which enables the monad to project its thread of life to the lower vehicles. For higher manas, which is technically, of course, manas taijasi. If you're not familiar with this term, it's a very wonderful one. I suppose I should put it up here for you. What am I doing? Kicking things. Which is the inwardly illumined manas. Manas illumined by its own reflective nature. So often it's the resplendent manas. Sometimes it's translated that way, or the illumined manas. But it's not illumined by anything outside, but its own interior nature is clear, it's in a reflection of Chidakasham in that sense, that it is inwardly illumined. Manas, then, inwardly illumined. Now, in a sense, what inwardly illumines it is, of course, that energy which is buddhi. So often we say buddhi manas. But by using the term manas taijasi, we point to the fact that in one sense, buddhi, as indeed kama, are energies which impel, which give, which give motion to whatever fabric they cling to, as it were. And therefore, while buddhi, as well as kama, are listed as separate principles, and indeed they are principles, you see, atma, buddhi, manas, these are principles, and we're clear on that point, and Jeffrey has shown us the diagrams. Buddhi, by itself, is far more, if we can put it this way, far more an energy than a principle which can result in a vortex forming some form. Irene.
I think HBB says somewhere that the primal energy resides in the buddhi.
In the buddhi, that's right.
Atma buddhi is inactive at the lower levels.
That's right.
Without manas.
Without manas. Yeah. And there's a statement in the Mahatma letters, I don't have the exact reference, but there's a statement in the Mahatma letters to that very same effect. Precisely. Yes.
Buddhi also is passive with respect to Atma.
Yes.
Buddhi is double. Is double. A higher and a lower always.
Well, to some extent, but it's like energy, and therefore this is the manas with that manas taijasi inwardly illumined by that energy which we call buddhi, inwardly illumined, because buddhi has become activated by its attachment to manas. Therefore, it glows, if you like. It enables manas to glow. It becomes then the aroma of manas. And so, as Barborka suggests, that this, which is termed the reincarnating ego, supplies the motivating impulse. It is manas, I'll give his quote again, it is manas, the mind principle, which enables the monad to project its thread of life to the lower vehicles. For higher manas, or technically manas taijasi, which is termed the reincarnating ego, supplies the motivating impulse for bringing the lower principles together for another incarnation on earth. So it is manas, or the manasic principle, which constitutes the link between each succeeding personality and the enduring self, or what has come to be called the individuality. And of course, as we see in the next shloka, shloka 6, that link or thread becomes more strong and radiant with every change. Now, we can recall at this stage the very beautiful passage in HPB's commentary on the previous shloka, which is just on the preceding page. The final paragraph in her commentary on shloka 4, just as milliards of bright sparks dance on the waters of an ocean above which one and the same moon is shining, so our evanescent personalities, the elusive envelopes of the immortal monad ego, and notice she combines here these two terms, twinkle and dance on the waves of Maya. They last and appear as the thousands of sparks produced by the moonbeams only so long as the Queen of Night radiates her luster on the running waters of life. The Queen of Night, that's the moon, of course, the period of a Manvantara. And then they disappear, the beams, symbols of our eternal spiritual egos, alone surviving, re-merged in and being as they were before, one with the mother source. So the pattern is established, an emanational pattern, which is called a journey, the journey through all the realms or fields of objective experience, a journey activated by manas, corresponding on the cosmic level to the activation of the journey by Mahat, which initiates indeed the journey known as cosmic evolution or unfoldment. So again, a reflection. And the journey itself is described now in this shloka in a most interesting manner that summarizes the entire evolutionary process undertaken by the spark as the monad, or, she says more properly, the jiva. I suggest that the journey or pilgrimage then may be seen both in terms of the forms through which the monad passes in the process of the unfoldment of its own inherent nature, and in terms of consciousness, each of the stages enumerated in the shloka corresponding then to a psychological stage in the awakening of consciousness. And really, in many ways, I prefer to look at it in that way because it brings it closer to home, in a sense. That these are stages, psychological stages. So we have simply the monad or spark, the jiva, journeys through the 7 worlds of Maya. These are, of course, the same as the 7 small wheels of stanza 6. Shloka 3, one giving birth to another. And when the sparks are separated by the energetic vortices that surround them, the outward appearance seems to be that of an independent reality. And this seemingly independent reality of the rim of the vortex is, of course, the great illusion of Maya, or it's an appearance of separateness. So HPB comments here that the phrase refers to the 7 globes of the planetary chain and 7 rounds, or the 49 stations of active existence that are before the spark or monad at the beginning of every great life cycle. And so this is what is being perceived now. And explaining this further, as I've already said, this is indeed what we've already called, what the stanzas have already called, the small wheels, one giving birth to another. In quite a lengthy letter to Sinnott, HPB, dealing with the subject of rounds, and this is incidentally both letter 99 and letter 97 in the letters of HPB to Sinnott, pages 248 and 244, HPB employs a diagram indicating the dual nature of the journey which is undertaken. And I think her diagram there, you find it, Jeffrey? I didn't make a copy of it, but...
Well, the diagram looks to be on...
Yeah.
It's a spiral one, is it? 46,
Yes.
47.
Yes, And it's that sort of thing. Now, whether we can make it visible enough, but she actually has two, she has two diagrams, but one aspect is, you see, she makes it in a spiral form, but in a sense there is within that. It's an interesting diagram, and I suggest you look at it later. It's one I really am not very good at putting on the board, so that's why I haven't attempted
One
it.
I couldn't understand.
Yes. It's not an easy one, and she has another one, you see, later, which seems to move in another centripetal direction. One aspect is that of matter, so I'll just leave it here, and afterwards you can look at it if you like and make... But one aspect is that of matter evolving from without within, while the other aspect is spirit evolving from within without, and that's the basic of it. That's really the basis of it. That one aspect is that of matter evolving from without within, and the other is spirit evolving from within without. As she says in connection with the diagram on page 252, this double evolution represents our humanity and world. So we can conjecture, in fact, that the journey is, in fact, a dual one, involving, as noted so often, both consciousness and form. And that's what she's getting at in her letter to Sinnott. I think it's quite an important point when we consider the stages as given in this shloka. Stages which are metaphorically given as metal and stone or mineral, plant and animal, followed by the statement that from the combined attributes of these, Manu, or man, the thinker is formed. In other words, I'm taking the words, and you may not agree with me, which is fine, but I'm taking the words combined attributes to refer to both the attributes of the form side of the journey and the consciousness or life side of the journey. The combined attributes of these. Out of the combined attributes. Now, without at this point, of course, entering into the entire subject, one can only note in passing that the study of this is really essential for a full understanding of the journey taken by the monad. I think it involves also the entire subject of the lokas and talas, frankly. And indeed HPB indicates that in her letter to Sinnott. And that subject is very well treated by, it's treated by Barborica in the Divine Plan. It's dealt with here in her letters to Sinnott, these two letters that I've just referred to, which are really fascinating letters, because in those letters, particularly those two letters, they begin, their letters 97 and 99, although I like to read them in the other order. Read letter 99 first and then 97, and I think it helps, you see. I think it really is a very useful explanation which she gives there of this. So in one sense then, and this is the point that I'm looking at it, that the journey here is metaphorically described. Now, that is not to say that it does not have further and deeper meanings over a long process. A very important point in connection with the journey itself, and I'm still talking therefore about the first part of this shloka, without going into it in detail, A very important point, it seems to me, is a statement which HPB makes in her commentary on page 238, that the whole secret of life is in the unbroken series of its manifestations, whether in or apart from the physical body. And this can only mean that the monadic evolution is continuous. We see or perceive only the broken steps, as it were, steps or stages, which we may call chains, rounds, incarnations, races, and so on. The importance of those steps, of course, in terms of physical incarnation, is emphasized in all her esoteric teachings. You see, HPB pointed out, and I think we've already referred to this in her esoteric teachings, volume 5, page 542. I've forgotten who of you, maybe it was, I guess it was Ianthe referred to this passage, that for our humanity, all this achievement of the dhyani state is reached on earth and in one or many of the incarnations. So she's very clear on that. So, as I've been saying, the journey of the spark may be seen either in its aspect of the forms utilized for the journey, or in its aspect of the consciousness awakened during the experience of the pilgrimage. It should be clear that it is not, of course, and this we have to remember, it is not the physical sheath of the stone that transforms itself into a plant, nor does the living plant metamorphose itself into an animal, but rather it is the monad that utilizes the vestures pertaining to each kingdom for the purpose of gaining evolutionary experience. And to emphasize this very point, HPB utilizes the Kabbalistic aphorism, a stone becomes a plant a beast, the beast a man a spirit, and the spirit a god. Her entire commentary on this greatest of all mystical sayings dealing with the monadic pilgrimage has to be studied very, very carefully. And on pages 246 to 248, she really gives great attention, I think, the very heart of the occult doctrine as it concerns the pilgrimage, as it affects the human stage, culminating in the achievement of the perfect man. And the process is beautifully described in metaphor that is, of course, can be applied to both form and consciousness. Just to note, in those pages, as she puts it, beginning on 246b, that paragraph with the letter B, the second sentence, the spark animates all the kingdoms in turn before it enters into and informs divine man. The monad or jiva is first of all shot down, I always like that, shot down by the law of evolution into the lowest form of matter, the mineral. Now this, of course, is starting at the mineral rather than the preceding three elemental kingdoms. After a sevenfold gyration encased in the stone, or that which will become mineral and stone in the fourth round, it creeps out of it, say, as a lichen, passing thence through all the forms of vegetable matter into what is termed animal matter. It has now reached the point in which it has become the germ, so to speak, of the animal that will become the physical man. All this up to the third round is formless as matter and senseless as consciousness. As Adam's been saying, we really have been told very, very little about the preceding rounds, and indeed about the preceding cycles of the globes preceding our fourth on this round. The information given us is paltry indeed. It's noted for its absence. And really isn't it? All right, for the monad or jiva per se, cannot be even called spirit. It is a ray, a breath of the absolute, or the absoluteness, rather. Notice that. Because, of course, the absolute cannot, by its very nature, have a ray. So I think that's why she uses the absoluteness. And the absolute homogeneity, having no relations with the conditioned and relative finiteness, is unconscious on our plane. Therefore, besides the material which will be needed for its future human form, notice that, the material, which is of course constructed of these previous form-building kingdoms, the monad requires a spiritual model or prototype for that material to shape itself into, and b, an intelligent consciousness to guide its evolution and progress, neither of which is possessed by the monad or by senseless though living matter. So, as she adds, the atom of dust requires the soul of life to be breathed into him, the two middle principles which are the sentient life of the irrational animal and the human soul, for the former is irrational without the latter. Well, remember that the pilgrimage has been through what are known as the three classes of the elemental kingdoms in the unmanifested realms prior to or below the mineral kingdom. And that pilgrimage or aspect of the journey is not referred to here, you see, because she begins with the mineral. The goal, therefore, is to achieve physical manifestation. When that has been achieved, and the anchorage is firmly established in the densest field compatible with the system, remembering that man and the planet he occupies are in a state of mutual correspondence or resonance, and a certain mastery over that field has been attained, then the pilgrimage turns upwards or inwards, and we carry with us, or the monad carries within it, the fruitage of its experience in the fields now successively mastered, fields here depicted as correlated with the well-known kingdoms, mineral, plant, and animal. These are the stages on the way, pauses in the journey, periods of rest between the outbursts of creative energy. And so the pattern is here. This is not the specifics, which we will get, and of course, in anthropogenesis, but the pattern is here. We can say that during these pauses, if you like, the free energy which has been thrust into the particular level is assimilated in the production of relatively stable forms. Each pause in the pilgrimage develops within the monad capacities and faculties appropriate to the fields in which the pauses occur, whether that pause be mineral, vegetable, or animal. All of these fields are then represented in the next higher stage. But entry into the human is effected, as we've already noted, in a most unique and spectacular manner. And it's that which Adam has emphasized, and so I'll leave it for him, because when we come to the Manasaputras and their work, that is the unique manner. But underlying the entire journey is this one sentient, formless existence. The same spiritual power, if you like, that shines with an incandescent brightness in the mind, glows luminously in the heart of every existent thing. Neither the self of man nor the heart of the atom is material. Both are sentient, both are formless, and both are living. Every part of the universe, then, is interdependent with every other part, and all are bound together into a meaningful whole by this purposeful and directed journey of the spark, from potential to actual understanding of its selfhood. Prem and Ashish in Man the Measure point out that every spark of the divine fire, no matter to what level its predominant characteristics belong, has its central heart or nucleus of awareness, a mental content, of ideal archetypal pattern, an impressionable surround of desire energy into which the pattern is projected, and the peripheral effects of the pattern, which in combination with other organizations may become apparent to sense perception. So it's all in the general pattern then. The archetypes, if you like, the pattern always precedes the production of the form. Hence the dual aspects, a descent of the spiritual hierarchy into increasing materiality and a corresponding production of forms which ascend from below. Both aspects are essential. And so it seems to me when the Sloka speaks of the 7 worlds of Maya, we must not think then that the journey is meaningless because it's Maya. And that, I think, is a tendency that can always creep in. But once it's called Maya, well then it's off there in the realm of illusion and is meaningless. The stages, true, are in realms of appearance, if you like, in which the reality is veiled, and the forms have to be perfected in order for that which will be called man, the human monad, to express itself. But there must always be a certain affinity between degrees of form and degrees of consciousness before the two can attract each other and come to a fruitful union. It is a meaningful stage. It's a meaningful development, indeed. And so it is from the combined attributes of these, in terms both of form and consciousness, that Manu, man the thinker, is formed. Now this is not to say that we have yet reached the human stage. Manu, man the thinker, is formed. But now comes, as we've said, this unique mystery in which in which Manas has to be activated, and that, of course, is the incarnation of the Manasaputras, or any other name you want to give to them, the Solar Pitris, the Agnishvatas, those whose it's interesting. The word Agnishvata, as you may know, means those who have been sweetened by the fire. Sweetened by the fire of the mind. So that they're it's going to taste good to us, in a sense, you see. They've been sweetened by the fire. As the Barhashads, indeed, were those who were not seated near it, but not really, did not get sweetened by it, of course, as yet. Well, the combined attributes, then, of all the powers that come to manifest existence from all of these, Manu the Thinker is formed, the only thinker in the universe, the only existent being capable of truly rational thought. So the Manu in this connection, the Manu the Thinker, is the total psychophysical organism, the mind at one end of the scale, the body, including the brain, at the other, and between them, the subtle intermediary vehicles of the sense powers, recorded memories, and instinctive forces which link the mind to the body. I've often thought in this connection, you see, that when one looks at this in terms of the characteristics from consciousness, that, and I don't think it's a point that can be overlooked, frankly. We have not left behind, in a sense, the mineral, plant, and animal kingdoms. We have not left them behind. And their attributes are still part of the attributes of human consciousness. And consequently, again, to take up another of my favorite themes, reflected in our language. because language reflects consciousness. And as our consciousness expands, so our language, but we are, by our very language, confined to metaphor. And consequently, the metaphors that we use are drawn from our past experiences, but not just past experiences in a sense within the continuum of human existence, but because consciousness is a continuum, it can draw on, and indeed does draw on, experiences, if you want to call it the monad, the spark's experiences, through previous fields, forms, which it has, out of which it has extracted the aroma. Let me illustrate. Have you ever known anyone with crystallized points of view? Have you ever known anyone whose life, whose thought is so lazy it seems to simply vegetate? Have you ever known someone whose mind is fiery, alert, and bubbling? You see, we use these, in a sense, as metaphors which can only be derived out of experience, but not the experience that we have had, if I may put it this way, that in terms of our entry into the human stage. But they are metaphors which are perhaps buried deep in the entire psychic nature of our being. And this, incidentally, is drawn from ideas now which suggest that there is what's called the archetypal school of linguistics, that it really does, when we are in a certain condition, that these metaphors more easily arise, these associations more easily arise, and that they are buried there somehow within us. I think there is a comparison here. I think there is you see, in terms of consciousness, the Manasaputras may have incarnated, but may I put it this way without doing any disservice to the Manasaputras? They incarnated, but there was already present a consciousness which they could activate. Can I put it that way? They did not incarnate into a vacuum, in other words, in which no consciousness existed. And consequently, in the very deep layers, if you like, very deep layers of psychic awareness, of consciousness, or the unconscious more properly, which can be tapped, there is indeed this stream which has resulted from, which is the combined attributes of the monadic experience, metaphorically through these previous kingdoms. Does that make sense? Does it make sense? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? And so it's all there within us, you see, from the combined attributes of these. And attribute is not simply a word applying to form by any means, but a word applying to a quality of consciousness, isn't it? You see. So that's why I began this morning with this very real emphasis on the fact that stop being tourists in the secret doctrine, sightseers just gawking at these things. What's being talked about is indeed you and I, you see. We are the process this is telling us something about ourselves in a very real, direct way. Not just a fanciful notion that's been nicely dreamed up, and marvelous as the notion may be, and it makes sense, and we all applaud it and say, yes, it's highly meaningful and so on, and we love studying it, and it gets us away from our daily problems and all the rest of it. We have a nice 2 weeks away from telephone and problems and all the rest, to come and just sort of gawk at these things. You know, I like the word gawk, as you can see. I think it has a nice, it's from the Anglo-Saxon, incidentally, gawk. Yes, it's not not from the Norman French. You know, it goes way back. You see, it's an ancient word. It's Anglo-Saxon in its origins. So that's why I rather like it, because it has that antiquity about it. You see.
Better than the modern equivalent of rubberneck.
Yeah, rubberneck. Anyway, my fascination with words may bore you, but anyway, you will remember me for something. But again, I emphasize, you see, that don't pass over this too hastily in that sense. We, you see, I mean, after all, we think we're Manu the Thinker. You know, we think we think. We don't do very much thinking, but we think, you see. And so is formed. Now that is not yet, as I say, the infusion of that activating energy which comes from a preceding hierarchy, from a hierarchy that has a special responsibility. But it's the combination that gives us a new responsibility, gives us a real duty, you see. How do we, you know, deal with this then? Well, all right. So we must take care not to bring up all the negative associations that have come to characterize the term thinker. I think, you see, unfortunately, from my point of view at least, there's been a certain tendency in some theosophical circles to denigrate the mind or the thinking function and to elevate other aspects of the human constitution. And yet we must recognize that there is the unalterable truth of the occult doctrine that everything in the manifest universe is an expression of the thought of the divine mind, carried outwards into existence by the dynamism of that universal mind, Mahat, a dynamism which we know as Fohat. Indeed, without the divine shining of mind, the form of man remains an empty, senseless Bhuta shell. And the elaboration of this theme comprises much of Volume 2, and therefore I'm not taking it up now, but the important point to note that only at the point of balance, the perfect balance between thinker and the vehicle of thought, does that which we call man come into existence. On the one side, that of form, the body without a mind, there is an emptiness, for the form alone is senseless and meaningless, as the stanzas of Volume 2 emphasize. On the other side of that balance, when the existent self of man reunites with the divine mind and passes beyond the threshold of manifestation, man as man no longer exists, since he has become, as one of us, to use biblical phraseology, a pillar in the temple of the Lord who will go forth no more. The question then comes in the, any comments on this before we proceed? Any comments, any questions, any?
One minor point, George, occurs to me, which I noticed in this particular sloka, is that the wording, as you find it on this page, differs from the wording that you find in the original statement of the stanzas at the beginning.
Yes, I failed to point that out, and that's very interesting, isn't it?
Not just here, but it's a general
Of course,
point.
it's a general point that, yes, it's a general point. So in my commentaries, I've been using it now as it is within the body of the text. But it is an interesting point, and one wonders what happened, you see.
What
Some are
is this
obvious.
that they...
If you go back to the original statement of the
Yeah,
stanzas, you see.
yes. Page 22 to 29.
Yes,
27 to 29.
yes, 27 to 29.
34.
Yeah, and you will note that very often, amazingly often, the shlokas as given in the body of the text in which she makes her commentaries differ from the way in which they are initially presented. For example, let's look at this one in her original presentation of it, you see. The spark hangs from the flame by the finest thread of Fohat. That's the same. It journeys through the 7 worlds of Maya. It stops in the first and is a metal and a stone. That's all right, isn't it? It passes into the second, and behold, a plant. The plant whirls through 7 changes and becomes a sacred animal.
There are 7 changes, 7 forms.
Yes, you see. 7 forms, and here it's 7 changes. Now that has a subtle difference, because it seems to me, and not just a subtle difference, but an actual difference, because there's a difference between change and form. And it's this that I've been emphasizing in terms of consciousness.
In one of the slokas we were looking at the other day, Mario, we missed out a word completely.
Yes.
I think, was it the previous sloka that we were looking at, or sloka 1, sloka 2, sloka 3, I can't remember. Sloka 2, I think.
Yes, the one like a thread through many jewels. Isn't it that one?
Well, the one I was thinking of was where it says, in the body of the text, it says, through the countless rays, the life ray.
Yes.
In the summary, it says, through the countless rays
proceeds the life ray. Yes. So there are these.
Well, fundamental.
Yeah. Not always fundamental, but sometimes, you see.
I've been wondering about the sacredness of the animal.
Yes, and becomes a sacred animal.
I'm wondering whether this has anything to do in the history of evolution with the animal-headed gods and the...
That is what I asked about, that sacred animal.
Yes, the sacred animal. This is a very interesting point. It just doesn't become an animal, but a sacred animal.
Yeah.
You see.
Inner animal. Inner. Different concept.
And you see her in her commentary, or in her presentation of it on page 238, she has in italics, in parenthesis, which she has added the first shadow of the physical man. So it's sacred in the fact that, it seems to me, that it refers to the man form, the first man form, rather than simply animal form, kingdom.
I had been thinking, Joy, the mammalian animals to have how you call a beginning of mind there, and maybe that is what make them sacred, that they have a sort of mind of thinking inside them already.
Well, depends, you see, on how one defines mind. Very often we've said in rudimentary, yes, to some extent, yes. Certainly in some of the higher forms of the animal kingdom there is a rudimentary intelligence.
Oh, yeah.
We have to see that, yes.
Maybe that is what make them...
But I think what's referred to here becomes a sacred animal. And then her comment, the first shadow of the physical man, would be indicative of the fact that it's a movement not simply into the animal kingdom per se, but into animal-like form, which will become the basis for the human vehicle.
They are the laggards of the previous Manvantara.
Maybe the laggards of the previous one. How would you interpret it, Adam?
Well, I agree with all of that. And one other thought occurs to me, and that is that the human form is a prototype for much else.
Much else.
The animal kingdom
Yes.
itself.
Yes.
And one of the fundamental propositions of volume 3
Yes.
is that the human precedes
Much of the yes.
and provides the prototypal form
Yes.
for it, and that's sacred animal.
Yes. I think sacred in that sense. Yes.
In this round only.
In this round only, yes. Oh, yes, yes. And of course, we are dealing now with the fourth round. We have been since that middle of stanza 6. We're dealing specifically with our fourth round, she's told us. Yes.
John, can I ask another question? How much importance do you attach to the capitals and the italics, for example, on page 246, 247? Sometimes monad is capital, and then the atom of dust requires soul of life in italics, and then after sentient life in italics, 247.
I attach a great deal of importance to that. I always feel when HPB underlines something in her manuscript, she wanted to call attention to it. When she used inverted commas, she was, I think, often indicating that this is what it could be called, but doesn't express the totality of it, or that it's easier to use that phrase, unless, of course, she's directly quoting, but it seems to me that these have significance. At least it's something that I think one has to think about in that. You see, she frequently, both on 246 and 247, she puts the term heavenly man in inverted commas, indicative of a designation that is given to this archetype, which also is in the human form becomes the prototype for other kingdoms, but becomes the prototype for this particular cycle, but also constitutes the archetype towards which, in terms of consciousness, one is striving. Yes, I think it has meaning. I wouldn't overdo the meaning. I feel sometimes we can get caught up in that. Of course, capitalization, this perhaps we should also be alert to. Capitalization in the last century was a very common sort of device, and many writers, even into the early part of this century, I often think of the struggles editorially when we used to go through some of Jeffrey Hodson's books, and Jeffrey capitalized everything endlessly. Everything was sort of capitalized, and of course this is no longer the custom. In fact, it's not that it's a brand new custom, because if you look at the King James Version of the Bible, which after all is an Elizabethan production, or post-Elizabethan, King James production of that period, the pronoun for God, he, is not capitalized, which comes as a shock to many people. But in its first printing, it was not capitalized. And then we went through this dreadful period, you see, particularly the Victorian period and on into the early years of this century, when, you wouldn't think of writing the personal pronoun for God, he, without capitalizing it, you see. Today, we've gone back, and it's not capitalized anymore. And we do not, capital letters are not as prevalent if you read contemporary writing. And this is true in Fowler's English, which is a standard work for all editors, Fowler's book on English usage. this is true at the University of Chicago Press, which is the standard work. Their manual of style is the standard work for all writing in the United States. It's not. And we follow Fowler's usage. So one has to be a little cautious, too, in the fact that when this was published, this was still very much the manner of writing, was to go ahead and capitalize anything that you thought needed sort of emphasis. But watch that.
HPB even capitalizes the adjective, but not the noun.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
There's esoteric science, you will give a capital E.
Yes. Mm-hmm. That's right. And today that is just not the custom. So one has to also see this within the period in which it was written and published. So you have to watch whether it's really for emphasis or is it simply the mode of writing, publishing at that time. Well, I've kept you beyond. You didn't even have a 45-minute break. Proceed. I'd just like to, because Gunnar reminded me that perhaps I had gone a little rapidly for my non-English speaking friends who are doing so well with English that I forget that it may not be their native tongue. And so I thought I'd just like to summarize briefly what I have been trying to say in regard to this first paragraph of this particular shloka. Because it seems to me that we can look at this, the combined attributes of these are man, the attributes both in terms of form and in terms of consciousness. And it's something that I think that, of course, HPB doesn't, she uses a lot of other things, and you can read that, and study it and so on. But what I feel we need to look at, again, as I've said, is in terms of ourselves. Because in some way we carry all of these streams within us, in some manner. Plus what has been added, of course, with the plus. But in a very vital way, we carry some of these streams within us. Certainly.
Embryo also. Embryo.
Yes, yes, and the recapitulation of the embryo, yes, during the period of gestation. But in terms of form, in many ways, we carry it within us. In terms of consciousness, it seems to me that we can see, in terms of consciousness, if you like. This is what, to me, is, I'm fascinated more by consciousness than form, recognizing the form is essential for the expression of consciousness, yes. And I'm not about to get rid of the form by any means. I mean, I bring it with me every day to this class, and there it is. We sometimes with great reluctance get it up in the morning, and with great happiness put it to bed at night, and, and of course if it dares to wake up in the middle of the night and doesn't want to go back to sleep, the consciousness within castigates it very severely, and, and so on. But there we are. We have it, and it's important. But I feel that really it is a vehicle of consciousness and the development of consciousness. And what do we have? In one way, and these are correspondences, if you like, rather than specifics, but certainly in one way. This, in one way, mirrors, if you want to put it that way, that the concept of separateness, which is very much there in the metal and stone. That is to say, a solid center, as it were, a really rigid center, which has to be, we've talked about this, not only as the great heresy, but as something that has to be. This is part of the pilgrimage, part of the journey, very, very much, in terms of consciousness. It's the establishment of that center, which is a kind of stone in the middle, if you like. It can be represented in that way, as a metal. It's a hard, you see, in that sense, self-enclosed. It is, in a sense, you see, a separated individuality. And it's very much the reflection of that experience, which is stable which has, to all extent, our normal perception, it has a tamasic quality, inert. Years and years ago, recognizing this, I wrote an article which got published, one of my early articles in the American Theosophist, on the value of inertia. I think, I've always been a great believer in something which I call rhythmic laziness. This value of really standing, really being, this
something
inert.
the elementals haven't got.
The elementals haven't got, no. But there it is, raised to a height in the mineral kingdom, the metal or stone, appearing inert. No, I know it isn't really, but it has that appearance, doesn't it, you see? Being stable. And so it gives us that sense, and perhaps, therefore, is reflected into that. In terms of form, well, it gives us also the basic structural possibility through, let us say, the bony structure, you see, if you like. But it's a structural possibility of form, isn't it? Do you see? So one could put over here in that sense. This gives structure in terms of form. It gives, you see, it gives you the skeleton on which to hang all the flesh and everything else, you see, in that sense, doesn't it? A skeletal sort of thing, which is very much the result of experience of form in the crystal kingdom, the kingdom of crystals.
We have to remember that it can exist in its three states, liquid and gas.
Oh yes, yes, that's right. So I'm overlooking those at the moment. I mean, true, some of us, you see, in our separateness let off heads of steam, which is the gaseous form, if you like.
But that is in an elemental...
Yes, that's right. All right, in terms of the plant, it's interesting. It seems to me this gives us, in consciousness, the differentiation possibility. That is to say, deviation. I suppose I should write it out, but I don't want to step down from my platform, like being on a height. Longer and longer arms. But in terms, it represents this branched sense life, if you like. Differentiation in terms of sense life. It's branched, you see. And this reflects really in form in the nervous structure, if you like. The structure of nerves, the differentiation, the branching out. You see, this is like a plant, isn't it? In the branching out. The whole nerve system. Do you see?
It's in the leaves, don't you?
It's in the leaves, you see, but it's the branching out of the nerve structure in our vehicle, in our body. Do you see? So there is a correspondence there.
The brain is a root.
Yes.
The brain is the upwards and back.
That's right. And you see the spinal column is the stem and the branches and so on. The intermixing of those branches and so on. All of that to the ganglia at the base of the spine, at the base of the head and so on, you see.
The veins and the arteries.
The veins and arteries and so on. So it gives this plant-like structure of the nervous system, doesn't it? Now the animal consciousness, you see, in terms of consciousness, the animal life, the animal kingdom, in terms of consciousness, gives us then, out of all of this, an awareness which leads to instinct, doesn't it? And in terms of form, gives us the blood, the red blood, the warm blood.
And it is Rajasic.
Rajasic, in that
And the
sense.
other is Sattvic.
Yes. Tamasic, Sattvic, Rajasic, if you like, in a sense. They're not exactly, but it's interesting to see. It's a combination. Yes. This is just a suggestion. And the combined attributes form, give man the form. Now this is therefore, up to a certain stage. Now, you see, what's going to happen? Well, Adam tells us this afternoon, I think, what's going to happen. But you see, in one sense, now you may not agree with all of this, but you begin to sense, you see, this pilgrimage in which we carry this still with us. Does this help, Gunnar, to sort of bring together what I'd been trying to say? Because I'm sorry that I seem to have gone so fast that it may have slipped by some. This is only a suggestion, as I interpret it, because, again, I feel we have to bring it to ourselves.
The explanation in the SD 247 halfway down and onto the next page in terms of spirit and matter is
Yes.
on this, and
Yes.
it indicates the pari passu development of
That's
the two
right.
sides.
That's right, yes.
It's worth making note of that.
Yes, and as Marion reminded me, which I didn't read, we have help in all of this. We have marvelous, I'm trying to find the statement that Marion called my attention to. It's on 247, isn't it, Marion? Oh dear, where?
Halfway down the long paragraph.
Oh yes, the Occult Doctrine teaches, there we are. Ah, yeah, teaches that while the monad is cycling on downward, in other words, we're given bicycles for this. So we have a lot of help, you see. Cycling on downward, there you are, the monad is got its own private bicycle, and there it is. 10 speed bikes, I expect, Oh, 7 speed. Well, we have some 10 speed bikes in the United States. I'm going to get a 10 speed.
More like capitalistic.
Oh, they're up to 18 in Canada, 18 speed bikes. Gee.
More advanced in evolution, no?
Yeah, that's right, you see. They're not going to be the laggards there in Canada, I can tell that. But, you see, isn't that marvelous, cycling down? Bet you never thought of that, did you? All right. Well, it seemed to me this might focus what I had been trying to suggest in terms of the pilgrimage, the journey. Now, this isn't to say that the other interpretations that we've been looking at are not correct, but that this brings it right to us, that this is within us. And so then the question comes, who forms him? And the answer given in the Sloka may seem very enigmatic, the 7 lives and the 1 life. But of course, if we recall the earlier stanzas, we understand the significance of this response. And it's this 1 life that furnishes indeed the dynamic evolutionary urge, the thrust, which is behind all nature. It's the same life that is present everywhere. All is life, and every atom of mineral dust is a life. Life, therefore, is everywhere. So it is indeed the 1 life. But it's at this point in explaining or commenting on the meaning of this portion of Sloka 5, you see, this particular portion, that HPB introduces, where is it? Introduces, she says, the doctrine teaches a strange lesson. And I'm trying to find where she says that. I think it's, the doctrine teaches a strange lesson. I'm sorry I don't see it at the moment. But she informs us of this.
248.
Is it 248? I thought it was, and then I couldn't see it at the moment.
In the who forms Manu?
Yes, and who forms his body, the life and life. Yes, yes, here it is. The doctrine, as to our outward physical bodies, the house or tabernacle of the soul, the doctrine teaches a strange lesson. I think that if we can try to see this, basically, the one life, of course, is the primary breath, which in its outward phase provides the dynamic thrust. The 7 lives, then, are the archetypal differentiations of that one life, differentiations which we may come to know as the small wheels or stages of the evolutionary cycle, the journey. These combine to provide the structural elements of man's form, and there are further ways in which to understand this phrase, the 7 lives. Barborka deals with this in quite some length, incidentally, in the Divine Plan. First note this long extract from the commentary on page, which begins on page 249 and continues to 250. The worlds to the profane are built up of the known elements. To the conception of an arhat, these elements are themselves collectively a divine life, distributively on the plane of manifestations, the numberless and countless crores of lives. Crore is, 100,000? I think a crore is 100,000, if I remember having to deal with this in the financial reports in India. A lakh is 1,000, and a crore is 100,000, I believe. Anyway, fire alone is one on the plane of the one reality. On that of manifested, hence elusive being, its particles are fiery lives, which live and have their being at the expense of every other life that they consume. Therefore they are named the devourers. Every visible thing in this universe was built by such lives, from conscious and divine primordial man down to the unconscious agents that construct matter. From the one life, formless and uncreate, proceeds the universe of lives. Then I call your attention to HPB's commentary a few pages over, 258. 259. Of course, she's telling us again, wherever there is an atom of matter, a particle or a molecule, even in its most gaseous condition, there is life in it. But then she says, in quoting, I think, without entering at length upon the description given of the higher lives, we must direct our attention at present simply to the earthly beings and the earth itself. This, as Irene said, we're dealing with the 4th globe in the 4th round. The latter, we are told, is built up for the 1st round by the devourers, which disintegrate and differentiate the germs of other lives in the elements. Pretty much it must be supposed as in the present stage of the world the aerobes do, when undermining and loosening the chemical structure in an organism, they transform animal matter and generate substances that vary in their constitutions. This is page 248. 258. Thus, occultism disposes of the so-called azoic age of science, neatly disposes of it, for it shows that there never was a time when the earth was without life upon it. That is, the occult doctrine shows that. Wherever there is an atom of matter, a particle or a molecule, even in its most gaseous condition, there is life in it. Now, continuing, then, of course, HPB next quotes a section, as she says, from the stanzas. evidently a commentary rather, from that book which she had omitted in her translation of some of the stanzas. Whatever quits the Laya state becomes active life. It is drawn into the vortex of motion, and note the clause, the alchemical solvent of life. Spirit and matter are the two states of the one, which is neither spirit nor matter, both being the absolute life latent. Notice this is from the Book of Dzyan, Commentary 3, para 18. She gives us a specific reference, as though we could go and look it up.
There's no book.
And there's no such book, you see, that we can get at. Spirit is the first differentiation of and in space, and matter the first differentiation of spirit. That which is neither spirit nor matter, that is it, the causeless cause. And that we call the one life, or the intracosmic breath. And then she continues her own commentary. Once more we will say, like must produce like. Now she has actually said this before, as Adam pointed out yesterday in one of the passages where she says, remember what we've said, when she'd never said it. But this she has said before, so she did remember on this occasion. Absolute life cannot produce an inorganic atom, whether single or complex. And there is life even in Laya, just as a man, and we've already quoted this in regard to the Laya centers. Then she continues, when the devourers have differentiated the fire atoms by a peculiar process of segmentation, it must be very peculiar to differentiate the fire atoms, the latter become life germs which aggregate according to the laws of cohesion and affinity. Then the life germs produce lives of another kind which work on the structure of our globes. At this point, you notice, let me give your attention to the footnote, although it really refers a bit later, but in regard to the first round. But it's an interesting footnote from Eliphas Levi. We won't read it. It's an amusing dig, really, at Eliphas Levi. But also with the clear statement that primordial substance, which here she calls, you notice, astral light, or he calls it, well, she calls it. Eliphas Levi ought to have added that the astral light or primordial substance. I would think really she should have used the term akasha at this point, Jeffrey, rather than astral light, because it was the original, it's the very essence. I think she really should have used akasha. Yes, she does. It's a bit confusing, but I think at this point.
But she sometimes qualifies that astral light.
Yes.
The upper or the.
That's right. But where she calls it here, that the astral light or primordial substance must be referring to akasha rather than astral light per se. And she elaborates on this concept that each round sees the development of one element. She's pointing out that in the first round, the globe, having been built by the primitive fire lives, formed into a sphere, had no solidity nor qualifications, save a cold brightness, no form, no color. It is only towards the end of the first round that it developed one element, which from its inorganic or simple essence became now in our round the fire we know throughout the system.
We have to remember here, just in case we're maligning her, that we are dealing with the four lower planes of existence.
Yes, that's true, yes.
Akasha on these planes could
be, yes, as the astral light. But you see, when she says, or primordial substance,
it's substance
differentiated down to this level. Yes, I think you're right. Yes, it's true. Well, of course, she continues that exposition of then the development of the elements through the rounds. But then comes this very fascinating statement on page 260 in the third paragraph. It is not molecularly constituted matter, least of all the human body, that is the grossest of all our principles, but verily the middle principle, the real animal center. This goes back to then what has been obtained from the journey in the sacred, becoming the sacred animal. The grossest, whereas our body is but its shell, the irresponsible factor and medium through which the beast in us acts in all its life. Every intellectual theosophist will understand my real meaning. Don't you love it?
Could we ask Adam the real meaning of
yes, all right.
I'm afraid I'm mentally lazy.
Halfway down the paragraph above,
yes.
towards the end of the Manvantara, this is in the after the seventh round.
What comes after the seventh round? Well, the
But there is an interesting suggestion that she makes about that somewhere else. She draws a parallel between the process of gestation, where she says that the fetus is in fact completed after 7 months into uterine life,
yes,
but requires 2 more months to complete itself, making it 9.
9.
And she says, similarly, there are processes of work in cosmos which are similar to that.
Similar to that.
And she actually talks about 7-fold and 9-fold patterns.
Yes.
And you wonder whether the formation of the Earth, I mean, it says in the paragraph above that it only achieves its ultimate form inversely in this to man.
Yes.
Ultimate form. Well, perhaps the whole process of gestation.
Yes. It may well be, you see, because the child born at 7 months, we say premature, but is generally able to sustain life, independent of the mother's womb. But the final 2... Yes, it was, yes. So... Well, she continues her commentary on the strange lesson which the occult doctrine teaches concerning the origin of the human frame and the mystery of the one life by reference to the 2 sciences of chemistry and physiology. And it's interesting at this point, she calls these the true 2 great magicians of the future. It's rather interesting. Very interesting. She points up the idea that the physical and chemical constituents of all beings has been found to be identical. And then she adds, and this is the middle of 261 then, not only the chemical compounds are the same, but the same infinitesimal, invisible lives compose the atoms of the bodies of the mountain and the daisy, of man and the ant, of the elephant and of the tree which shelters him from the sun. Each, at times I think she becomes a bit poetical, not just of the elephant, but of the tree, not just of the elephant in the tree, but of the elephant and of the tree which shelters him from the sun. I think she really had this mystical quality, which is typical of the Russian psyche, and she has this quality of putting it in. Each particle, whether you call it organic or inorganic, is a life. Every atom and molecule in the universe is both life-giving and death-giving to that form. It is that mysterious life represented collectively by countless myriads of lives that follows in its own sporadic way the hitherto incomprehensible law of atavism. Very interesting. Atavism is a throwback to, it's the concept of, it's a law, rather interesting. Much more, of course, is added about the fiery lives, and the entire subject, of course, deserves much more attention than we have time for. It's a strange lesson, indeed, which the esoteric philosophy presents, another truly profound mystery. One final quote in this connection. On page 263, then, one thing is sure, she says, one thing is sure in this, the knowledge of the ultimate essence of every element of its lives. You see it towards the top of 263. And she says, however it may be, one thing is sure in this: the knowledge of these primary causes and of the ultimate essence of every element of its lives, their functions, properties, and conditions of change constitutes the basis of magic. 263. So to return to the question of the Sloka, who forms him, we have the response, the 7 lives and the 1 life. Collectively, these are responsible for the structural elements. At the same time, the 7 lives may be interpreted in 2 ways. The simultaneous evolution of 7 human groups on 7 different portions of our globe, and the 7th class of beings who actually condense man's physical body around the extruded linga sharira of the lunar petries.
Where are you now, Pete?
Well, it's not in the Secret Doctrine. What I'm suggesting may be an interpretation. Both of these aspects of the term, the 7 lives, I think are possible interpretation then, you see.
Could you repeat that, please?
I would say they could be interpreted in 2 ways, and in this I follow Barborka's suggestion that they could be interpreted first as the simultaneous evolution of 7 human groups on 7 different portions of our globe, and the 7 lives as the 7th class of beings who actually condense man's physical body.
Because when those groups were on the globe yet wasn't solidified.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Well, at this point now, another question is asked: who completes him? The 5-fold law, and of course law is the Tibetan word simply for a spirit, a god, or we can say one of the hierarchies of the Dhyan Chohans, and may here refer to the functional powers which complete the psychophysical organism. These are indeed, the term God or gods in the ancient world referred to what we can call non-personal modalities of living powers. That is, powers which provide man with attributes and at the same time rule him by determining the extent of his functions. Why 5-fold? Well, again, because these are the 5-fold law are the solar petries who awaken the 5th principle. This is the task of the 5th hierarchy, isn't it? To inform the empty and ethereal animal form and make of it a rational man. So we have, in these first 2 questions, the answers to the origin of the structural elements of man's form and the origin of that which will determine the pattern of evolution as a vehicle of sense and intelligence. But in the total organism, at this stage, thus produced, there is nothing as yet to distinguish man from animal. There's no freedom to choose, for instance, between acceptance of glandular stimuli and instinctive habit patterns. Conditioned reflexes, no freedom of selective attention. There's no power of rational communication, no perception of ethical values, no self-awareness, no intentional transcendence of limitation, no understanding, no perception of meaning, nothing but instinctual power drives, nothing worthy of the name of man, although man is formed, you see. Hence we come to the 3rd and final question of this shloka: and who perfects the last body? Fish, sin, and soma. This is what Edita has been waiting for, you see. Because up to this point, you see, all right, the powers are there, the organism is there, but I've said nothing is there as yet to distinguish man from animal. Particularly no freedom to choose between acceptance or rejection of You see, glandular stimuli, which is at the physical level, and, many psychologists, the behaviorists, stay with that. Your action is simply nothing other than glandular stimulus, the response to glandular stimulus, you see. This was very prevalent in the Middle Ages, you see, with the four humors, so-called, you see. And so the response always was to any illness to bleed him. Get the leeches, Isn't that right? You see. Sort of change this function. So it was very much connected with the blood at that stage, wasn't it? You see. All right, Fish, Simmons, Soma. A wealth of symbolism, indicative of inner powers that raise the totality of man, this stage, to perfection. And therefore, HPB in her commentary on 263 says, what have fish, sin, and moon, what has the moon to do in all this, we may be asked, you see. Mm-hmm. What have fish, sin, and moon in the apocalyptic saying of the stanza to do in company with the life microbes? Well, with the latter, nothing. With divine perfect man, everything, since fish, sin, and moon, and she's translated Soma now into moon, make conjointly the three symbols of the immortal being. And of course then she tells us this is all that can be given, nor does the writer pretend to know more of this strange symbol than may be inferred about it from exoteric religions, from the mystery perhaps which underlies the Matsya, fish, avatara of Vishnu, which is one of the principal representations of Vishnu. But I really am inclined to doubt her disclaimer to a deeper knowledge. I think she had it. She just wasn't going to give it out at this point. But each of these three symbols lends itself to deeper and ever deeper exploration. So perhaps we can hint at least at some of the meanings in them. Fish, perhaps the vast multitudes of forms, silvery forms, to which the ocean of life gives birth. Each form a reflection of the one moon in the running waves of all the rivers of earth. Darting, the darting about in the symbol of fish is associated with Vishnu, as she's already said. The symbol associated incidentally in so many mythologies with Joshua, with Jesus. In the Babylonian and Chaldean mythologies, a man-fish appears. It is the symbol again and again of the Piscean age, of course.
Bishop's mitre.
The bishop's mitre, yes, very much.
I have a relation.
Mm-hmm.
I have a relation.
Good.
For me, fish is water and sattvas.
Yes.
The sin is earth and tamas. And Soma is fire and rajas.
There's
Three powers.
Three powers, Rajas, Sattva, and Tamas. Tamas, Rajas, and Sattva. Yes? Very interesting to contemplate what this symbol of fish, you say, the Chaldean, this is the man-fish in Babylonian and Chaldean in the mysteries of Jesus, certainly still there in the bishop's mitre, very much. The Piscean quality. Very interesting. It runs through, you see, the personage of Joshua, the son of Nun, the fish. And undoubtedly relates to the lunar ancestors, the Petries, as she suggested, you see. So we have a great deal of symbolism. Vishnu's incarnation, which I never really had a chance to pursue further in the Matsya or fish avatara symbol. But it's there in so many mythologies. And so one needs to look at it. Fish, Sin, the Chaldean moon god, Enzu, the Lord of wisdom, the knowledge or wisdom aspect of the divine mind. This is the moon of whose reflection in the waters of life we've just spoken. The power which manifests the slow unfolding of the divine wisdom in successive stages. Yet the use of the word sin, and it's interesting, HPB herself indicates that it has its own original meaning as sin. The fall of spirit into matter, often termed the original sin, is a most interesting one, pointing to a deeper symbolism. All of these symbols then point to the lunar aspect, you see, which really helps to perfect the form, which is the question, you see. Question is asked, who perfects the last body? You see, the final product. Fish, sin, and soma, all related to the moon, all very much related to the moon. Soma is, of course, the fluid pressed from the magic lunar herb of Vedic ritual. It's very much found in the Vedas, soma, as the fluid which is pressed from a lunar herb represents the intoxicating power of the divine desire, which urges the gods to manifestation. The same desire energy is responsible for the sense of separateness, without which there can be no manifestation. And this is associated with the separate drops of soma that descended from the filtering cloth in the Vedic tradition. So there are three aspects of one power, aspects which perfect or make possible the expression of the last body of man. Without a form, man is an unidentifiable spark merged in the sea of universal fire. Without understanding, man is an unperfected animal. Fish provides form, then. Sin provides this thrust towards knowing both good and evil, if you like. So without understanding and without the living power of desire, soma, the intoxicating drink, the living power of desire, man is an inert lump.
The moon gave us her life fire.
Yes, you see.
This is soma.
So soma, you see, is said to be that mysterious essence which is said to grant immortality. And in fact, the interesting thing about this soma as the intoxicating drink is also said to be distilled from the fig tree. And this is of particular interest, if you like, in connection with the story of Parsifal as told by Wolfram von Eschenbach. Wolfram, in fact, in his so-called apology for telling the story, which doesn't come at the beginning of Wolfram's. Wolfram tells, I think it's at the beginning of the 3rd chapter, in fact, in Wolfram, he inserts an apology in the story of Parsifal. And there he makes reference to fig leaves, that he says that he would be naked as rising from his bath were it not for the covering of fig leaves.
Yeah.
And we have this, of course, this fig leaf in Genesis, don't we? You see. Now, it points, I think, of course, to corroboration of my own view that Wolfram was at least a disciple of an initiate in the sacred mysteries, that he was aware of that which distills this sacred drink, soma, the fig leaf, the fig. Therefore, there is one suggestion is at least that that soma refers to this drink which gives immortality, a lastingness. It's a living power of desire, of the energy which infuses the entire system for as long as the system lasts.
In some of the Buddhist traditions, it's always pointed out as the glomerate fig. In other words, the only one that flowers inside.
Inside.
As opposed to flowers exposed outside. Comes to bloom inside.
Inside. It's rather interesting, you
So
see.
you point there that the energy of desire change through life, but could never die, could never pass away.
That's right. For as long as the system lasts. Form and consciousness will always be part of the system as long as manifestation endures, for the Mahamanvantara, if you like.
Could you repeat the functions of fish and sin again? Sin was to do with the construction
Well,
of the
fish then has to do with form. Ever changing, ever darting about, but you see, fish in that sense gives form. Sin gives understanding. And soma, the thrust of energy or desire.